The Tain Plantation gleamed like a white jewel against the low country marsh, its colonnaded mansion rising from live oaks and shadowed lawns as if prayer alone had lifted it there. In the summer of 1836, Charleston spoke Mrs. Eleanor Tain's name, with a mixture of envy and admiration. 3 winters a widow, she had not merely kept her late husband's estate from collapse, she had expanded it. Her rice grew thick as carpets in the sun, her horses drew nods from rivals, and her ledgers, so people said, balanced like a hymn. Mrs. Tain, you continue to astonish us, Judge Hale declared at a summer soiree. Glass lifted, eyes on the mansion's perfect line. Your cotton yield has even surpassed the Pinckney place this season. Eleanor's smile was careful, polished to a blade's thinness. God provides for those who provide for themselves. Judge, what Charleston did not see stood behind the hedges and magnolia bloom, a long, windowed outbuilding the household called an infirmary, and the enslaved, in private whispers, called something else. Their order sharpened into cruelty, records were kept, bodies managed, births logged as profit. The plantation's shine had a cost no prayer could cleanse. The morning after Judge Hale's praise, Isaiah began work before dawn, hands raw from the road from Virginia and the auction block. He scrubbed the marble entry under Agatha's steady eye, the head-house servant moving with the quiet authority of one who had long survived the place. "Keep your head down and your ears open," she murmured when she passed. "Curiosity here can be deadly." Isaiah nodded, listening. Above him, steps drifted across the upper floors. The measured tread of Mrs. Tain, the quick patter of her 3 daughters, Caroline, the eldest, with her mother's cool composure, Josephine, quick-eyed and inward, and Beatrice, young enough to look frightened by her own shadow. Commands stitched the house together, polite in the parlor, sharp in the hallway, iron by the back stairs. By mid-morning, Isaiah was sent to the stables, where peat and leather softened the air. Jonas, a man hollowed by years, worked a brush along a bay's flank with hands that knew the motion, even when the mind wandered. "You're new," Jonas said, eyes flicking toward the door for overseers. "Where from?" "Hanover County," Isaiah replied. Jonas considered him. Most men brought in lately got a purpose. Before Isaiah could answer, Silas Webb, broad, damp with rain, filled the doorway. "You!" he snapped at Isaiah, offering a sealed envelope. "To Dr. Parnell in town now, and keep your mouth shut." It was the sort of errand a man could use. Isaiah took the road to Charleston with the letter hidden in his coat and his real purpose in his throat. Find Ruth. She had been sold months earlier and by rumor swallowed by Tain. He moved through the harbor's noise to the brass-plated door of Dr. Maxwell Parnell, handed over the letter, and waited while a pale assistant vanished inside. Outside, 2 planters talked low and practical as men discussing timber. "Another dozen next week from the widow," one said, checking his watch. "Stock's young. Market's eager. Tain's program's the most efficient in the state," the other answered. "Program. Efficient." Isaiah fixed the words in his mind. The return path bent behind the plantation, where marsh met fence and the back lawns leaned toward kitchens and smokehouses. There, screened by live oaks, stood the outbuilding he had heard about. Glass windows veiled by heavy drapes, a door locked from within, a woman in white carrying a satchel and not looking left or right. The air around it seemed to hold its breath. That night, while thunder stitched the sky, Isaiah met Phyllis by the smokehouse, an older woman whose hands remembered 100 meals and 1,000 kindnesses nobody counted. "My sister," he said, voice low. "Ruth?" Phyllis's mouth tightened. "That place is called an infirmary for decent ears," she said. "Don't call it that here. They keep women there. No one walks out easy. Is Ruth inside?" Phyllis's eyes softened. "Yes." Then, after a beat, a whisper of risk. "If you're set on foolishness, don't go through the front. There's a wash-house tunnel. Old passage. Servants used to move unseen." She pressed a small key into his palm. "If you're caught, it's all our necks." Across the yard, candlelight drew rectangles on the mansion's lawn. Inside, the evening played out like a piece of polished silver. Caroline laughed lightly at Thomas Blackwood's courtly stories. Josephine wrote and rewrote words in her head she would later keep in a journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Beatrice sat with hands folded tight, smile trembling whenever her mother's gaze passed over her. A new guest stood beside Thomas, Lieutenant James Blackwood, recently returned from military service. He watched the room the way soldiers watch horizon lines. When Isaiah entered with a tray, the lieutenant noticed him noticing the house. Eleanor timed her entrance like a conductor. "Lieutenant Blackwood," she said warmly, eyes cool. "Your family's fields border ours to the south. You must tour our operations tomorrow. I think our methods will interest a progressive young planter." Josephine's stomach went cold. Her mother never invited outsiders close without intent. After the guests withdrew and the storm grew teeth, Josephine lifted the floorboard and pulled free her leather-bound book. She had begun with small things, deliveries, visits, expenses, but the entries had darkened into a ledger of the estate's true engine. Doctors' calls, special rations for selected women, private ledgers that tracked people as if they were yields. Tonight she wrote, August 17, 1836. Another girl taken to the infirmary. 17 women now, Dr. Parnell twice weekly. Records kept in a separate hand. She paused, hearing the rain lash the glass and a footstep in the hall. The house breathed around her. Somewhere far off, a door sounded in the wind like a gunshot. Downstairs, Isaiah trimmed lamps and mapped in his head the lines of house and yard, the way a man maps a river by sound. The tunnel, the key, the woman in white. Ruth's name beating in time with the rain. Eleanor sat in her study, quill scraping across columns of figures as lightning lit the room in hard white. Silas Webb waited, hat in hand, and Dr. Parnell's reply lay opened beside her. She did not need the storm to feel power. She had built her own weather here, carefully managed, thoroughly recorded. "Profitable, tomorrow," she said almost to herself. "We show the lieutenant what progress looks like." Outside, the oaks writhed under the wind. The cicadas went silent. Somewhere in the dark beyond the hedges, the infirmary's locked door held, and a man with a stolen key tried to believe doors could be opened. Dr. Maxwell Parnell believed in surfaces, scrubbed tin, boiled gauze, instruments lined like soldiers. Order made him feel absolved. The building they called the infirmary held 12 small rooms, lamplight pooled low and sour with carbolic. Women rested 2 to a chamber when the beds were full. Names were written only in one place, his ledger, never on lips. "Subject 23 shows good recovery," he told Nurse Hammond, who answered with a clipped nod. "Milk adequate. Infant thriving." In a rocking chair by a shaded window, Ruth stared through the drape's weave and let her body do what bodies do. She kept her mind somewhere else, a river she had known in Virginia, her brother's laugh, the ash tree that spread over their yard like a hand in blessing. Nurse Hammond moved on, voice low, shoes muffled on the boards. A knock came, sharp, professional. A note from the big house invited Dr. Parnell to dinner. Eleanor Tain wished to discuss bloodlines. "Twice this week," Nurse Hammond said. "Progress," Parnell answered, as if that word covered everything. Outside, rain rinsed the live oaks and lifted the scent of the marsh. Isaiah worked the garden border beneath an open window, trimming shrubs smooth as a wall. He kept his face down, ears open, as Agatha had counseled. "Your irrigation is impressive," a man's voice said beyond the hedge. "Crisp and curious." "Necessity breeds innovation," Eleanor replied, pacing James Blackwood past the rice flats, with a tour she controlled as tightly as her accounts. "After supper, we'll see a venture few outsiders appreciate. Animal husbandry." Isaiah's hand paused on the shears. The woman in white he'd seen carried her satchel across the yard and vanished through a locked door. In his palm, the small key Phyllis had given him felt like a hot coin. Up in the east wing, Beatrice stared at her reflection, cheeks too pale against the thunder's blue flicker. 18 loomed like a date carved into stone. A careful diet, rides time to the week, Dr. Parnell's cool fingertips counting her pulse and the seconds. "Family duty," her mother called it, voice warm, will iron. A quick knock, Josephine's rhythm, tapped the frame. She slipped inside, closed the door and locked it. "We need to talk," she whispered. "I can't," Beatrice said, voice thinning. "If Mother hears—" "Then lower your voice." Josephine sat on the bed and took her sister's hands. "What happened to Caroline didn't end in the stables and ledgers. It runs under the house itself," Beatrice swallowed. "Caroline says Father began it. That it's scientific, that I should be proud." "Proud of what?" Josephine's mouth twisted. "I found Father's private notes. And Mother's. Additions. Selected women. Controlled pairings. Records like breeding cattle. It doesn't stop with the quarters." She hesitated, then said the thing she had not yet said aloud. "There are entries that suggest surrogates carried children for the family." For us, Beatrice went very still. The storm threw light across her face, and for a moment she looked like a portrait of someone else. "You mean—" I do not know whose bodies bore us. And Mother intends to put you inside her design when you come of age." A second knock came, softer, a code from kitchen years. 3 quick, a pause, 1 more. Josephine cracked the door, expecting Phyllis, and found Isaiah rain-slick and urgent. "Miss Josephine," he breathed, "your mother is taking the lieutenant to the infirmary now. My sister is inside. I need your help." "You'll have it," Josephine said before Beatrice could speak. "But you help us too. We need proof, ledgers, anything to end this." Isaiah nodded once. "There's a tunnel," he said, "from the wash-house." They moved like ghosts through back corridors and stairwells servants used. The yard was a sheet of needles. Thunder rolled the ground underfoot. In the wash-house, copper tubs steamed in the chill. Isaiah slid one aside, heavy, practiced, and pried up a trapdoor cut cleanly into stone. The passage breathed cool and damp. Lantern light jittered along brick walls and a packed earth floor. 50 yards in, the tunnel forked. "Right goes to the infirmary," Isaiah said. "Phyllis told me." "What's left?" Beatrice whispered. "Unknown," Josephine answered. "Which is exactly why we start there." The left-hand corridor ended at an oak door banded in iron. The lock was a clenched fist. Josephine pulled a ring of keys from her pocket. "You stole those," Beatrice murmured, half appalled, half relieved. "I borrowed them from a thief," Josephine said, and the third key turned. Air inside the room was sweet and chemical. Shelves with glass-fronted cases lined the walls. A desk stood in the center, crowded with notebooks and instruments whose purposes were clear without names. Lantern light found rows of floating pale shapes in jars, labeled in a careful hand. Dates, lineages, reasons for termination. Josephine's breath hitched, but she did not look away. "Records," Isaiah said, keeping his voice steady by force. "Take the records." She opened a leather-bound book. "Parnell's notes," she whispered, leafing pages, pace quickening. 20 years. Pairings, outcomes, projections. And here, she tapped an inked crest pressed into the paper, Tain. Not only the enslaved. Surrogates for the family, children raised as legitimate names. My name. She went paler, then set her jaw. "This is enough to drown them." "Not yet," Isaiah said. "We still need Ruth." Footsteps echoed down the right-hand branch, murmurs caught and carried by the damp. Eleanor's voice, bright steel, and a man's reply moving with it. Josephine snapped the book closed. "B, this sack," she said, finding a canvas bag under the desk and loading ledgers, journals, loose sheaves. "Take it back through the wash-house and hide it beneath my floorboard. If we're not back by dawn, go to Judge Hale in Charleston. Only him. Say you have my statement." Beatrice looked at the jars, at the inked crest, at her sister's face. The world she had stood inside all her life had shifted an inch to the left and now showed its edges. She hugged the sack under her cloak and nodded. "I'll wait 1 hour," she said, voice thin but even. "Then I run." The lantern snuffed with a soft kiss of smoke. They felt for the door in dark and found the corridor again by touch. Turning right this time, moving toward the sound of voices and a wedge of lamplight on packed earth. "With careful selection, we've raised birth weight by 12%, someone said in the infirmary. More lecturer than human. Infant losses under 5. "Remarkable," the lieutenant replied, voice measured to an edge Isaiah couldn't read. "And these women?" the man asked. "Mostly enslaved," Eleanor answered. "Mixed lineage for certain trials. The secret is record-keeping and control." They reached the small service door that opened onto the main corridor. Through the crack, Josephine glimpsed a spill of hallway, a wash of light, the swing of a white sleeve. Eleanor stood near a windowed room like a hostess at a ball. Behind the glass, a woman lay with a newborn at her breast. Nurse Hammond counting something off with a pocket watch. At the far end, Dr. Parnell hovered with a ledger like a priest with a missal. "My sister," Isaiah whispered. "Third door on the right, recovery ward." "We need a diversion," Josephine started, then froze. Another voice cut the air like a whip. Carolyn's. "Mother!" she cried from the main entrance, rain in her hair, a pistol in her hand. "Josephine and Beatrice are missing." "I found this." Pages fluttered, a book yanked open in the wind. "They know." Eleanor's face hardened smooth as porcelain. "Find them," she said without raising her voice. "Lock the gates." Question everyone. Mr. Webb, ready the men." The calm broke like glass. Doors slammed, orders ricocheted, feet pounded. In the passage, Josephine's and Isaiah's eyes met, and together they let the door open a fraction more. "Steady," Josephine whispered, the word for him and for herself. "We go now." "We take Ruth first." Isaiah slid forward into the light, movements precise as if each step had hinges. Josephine followed, the sound of rain and boots and the tin rattle of keys building into a single terrible drum. Behind them in the dark, the door to the hidden room swung slowly on its hinges and came to rest, closed as if it had never been opened. Chaos ran the length of the infirmary like a split seam. Doors thudded. Keys struck iron. Rain peeled against the shutters and leaked in thin threads through a swollen sash. In the sudden tangle of orders, "Lock it, bring Webb, count the beds." Josephine and Isaiah slipped into the light and flattened against the wall. Third on the right, Isaiah breathed. They moved between panes of glass where women slept or stared, with the exhausted ferocity of new mothers. Josephine kept her chin high, her hands steady, her borrowed keyring hidden in her sleeve. A nurse wheeled a cart past them, a bite of carbolic in the air, clean metal, boiled linen. When the cart turned, Josephine palmed a forceps and let it fall. The clatter was bright as a shot. Nurse Hammond pivoted toward the sound. "Mind your hands," she snapped at no one in particular, and bent to collect the instrument. Isaiah was already at the third door. Inside, Ruth sat propped with pillows, eyes hollow from too much vigilance, a small sleeping weight warm at her breast. She looked up at the man in her doorway and did not breathe for the count of 3. "Ruth," he said, and the held breath broke. Her first word was no, reflex, protection, disbelief. Then it changed in the same breath into Isaiah, and her arms tightened around the child. "We don't have time," he murmured, crossing to her, hands hovering before he dared touch her shoulder. "Can you stand?" "Yes." She set her jaw, easing the infant into the crook of one arm and pulling the blanket over his head against the light. "Where?" "Back door. Service hall. Josephine knows the way." "I do," Josephine said from the threshold, and the calm in her voice surprised even her. She stepped inside, flipped the door's latch and pressed her ear to the wood. Footsteps hammered past, then faded. "Now!" They moved through the narrow spill of corridor between rooms, Josephine first, then Ruth and the baby, Isaiah behind, shoulders squared to block the view from any sudden angle. Twice they had to stop, once to let a house servant with a stack of folded gowns sweep by, once because a key scraped in a lock 6 feet ahead. Josephine tugged them into a linen closet, held the door almost closed, and let the thin line of light paint dust across her sleeve, while a pair of overseers clattered past, the sour leather smell of damp coats filling the small space. "Miss Tain," Ruth whispered, not sure yet what to call Josephine when the world seemed to have come loose. "Yes," Josephine answered, "but not that kind." A cooler drifted through the hall, night air from a maintenance door cracked to the rain. Josephine slipped out, then beckoned. On the far side of the corridor, Eleanor's voice carried like a bell. "Mr. Webb, we will not have panic. Count the women. Lock the ward. Caroline with me." Josephine flattened them all against the wall as Eleanor and Caroline strode across the intersection at the hall's end, skirts dark with water, Caroline's pistol at her side like an accusation. For a heartbeat, Caroline's eyes slid toward the service passage, the smallest motion, and Josephine felt like a cold hand the old childhood sense that Caroline always knew. The moment passed. They went on. "Left," Josephine said, voice a thread. "Stairs." They reached the back stair, a 2-flight run with a window at the landing where Rain wrote small signatures. Josephine put her shoulder to the exit at the bottom. It gave an inch and bit. She set her teeth, shifted the angle, and the latch yielded. The yard hit them in a sheet. The world beyond the door was all smell. Wet earth, river, lime from the washhouse, and sound, wind in the live oaks, shouts at the big house, the low thunder of hooves somewhere out of sight. Josephine shoved the door almost closed and breathed, for the first time the barest shape of relief. "Straight to the washhouse," she said. "Tunnel will take us under the yard." Ruth nodded, jaw locked. The baby stirred and settled again, his breath a warm tick against the blanket. They kept to the building's lee, moving in a crouch along the infirmary wall, past a shuttered window where lamplight laid stripes on the wet bricks. past a rain barrel brimful and shining like dark glass. They were 10 yards from the wash-house when Silas Webb stepped out of the shadow of the smokehouse with 2 men at his back. "Well," he said, voice almost pleasant, "evening stroll?" Isaiah shifted to put himself between Webb and Ruth. The overseer's shotguns looked freshly oiled, as if they had been waiting for rain to stop. Webb's gaze rested on Josephine for a careful beat, then flicked to Ruth's arms. "Put the child down," he said, "and come along." "No," Josephine replied. She didn't know she would say it until after she had. Webb smiled with only half his mouth. "Miss Josephine, you don't tell me no. Your mother pays me to collect strays and trouble." "You look like both." Isaiah's hand went to the knife at his belt. Webb's eyes dropped, then returned to Isaiah's face as if amused by the predictability of courage. "Don't," Josephine said softly to Isaiah without looking at him. Then to Webb. "My mother also pays you to keep her reputation immaculate. What keeps it cleaner? 3 people slipping in the rain or a shouting match under the infirmary windows?" Webb tilted his head. "You think the weather will wash this away?" "I think you know the value of a quiet solution," she said, and took one measured step forward, enough to draw his attention, not enough to put her within his reach. Behind her she felt Isaiah shift again, ready if talk failed. A horse breathed somewhere close. Boots struck puddled ground at a canter. James Blackwood came into the wash of the lamplight from the infirmary's last window, rain running in sheets off the brim of his hat. He took everything in, the door ajar behind them, Webb's men with their guns too casual to be harmless, the baby's dark curl against Ruth's shoulder, and let his horse settle at a shallow angle that put its bulk between Webb's line of fire and the fugitives. "Mr. Webb," he said, voice clipped and civil. "Mrs. Tain requests you at the front." 2 women in the ward are unaccounted for. Webb didn't look away from Josephine. "And what's that to you, Lieutenant?" "Order," Blackwood said with the patient disdain of a man who has worn it like a uniform. "So your employer prefers it." Webb's smile didn't change. "Your interest in our back doors is very thorough for a dinner guest." Blackwood's free hand slid into his coat as if reaching for a handkerchief. "I'm thorough," he said. "It's a flaw." Josephine saw the small movement and felt something tighten in her spine, not fear, but a sense that the ground under all of them was about to shift. Blackwood's eyes flicked to hers for the barest fraction of a second, and then passed her to the wash-house, where the door stood a dark square against darker brick. "Miss Tain," he said evenly, "you're standing in the rain. Go inside before you take a chill." The sentence was harmless on its face and so baldly improper, ordering a mistress to obey, that Webb barked a laugh. But Josephine heard the map inside it. Go. Now. She didn't wait to decide whether to trust him. She turned, pushed the wash-house door and ushered Ruth through. Isaiah backed after them, never taking his eyes from Webb until the last sliver of light cut off, and the room filled with steam and the copper glow of dormant tubs. "Trap door," Isaiah said. Under the big tub. Together he and Josephine slid the tub on its runners, muscles burning, water sloshing from its lip onto the floor in warm sheets. The hinged stone lifted with a long, damp sigh. Air rose cool from the tunnel. Ruth went first, baby tight against her, feet finding the steps by feel. Josephine followed, skirts dragging, shoulder pressed to Ruth's back as if to carry her by contact. Isaiah came last and pulled the door down, leaving only a finger's width of darkness for his eye. Outside, voices braided into the rain. "What did you think you were going to do?" Webb asked Blackwood, amusement thinned to annoyance. "Walk them through me." "If necessary," Blackwood said. "But I prefer not to waste ammunition. Then step aside after you answer a question." "Make it quick. Where is your authority in this yard drawn from?" Blackwood asked mildly. "From Mrs. Tain, certainly. From the law, perhaps less so." There was a pause, and in that pause Josephine heard the click of something small and bright, metal against teeth or a loop of cord. Then 3 sharp blasts cut through the weather, high and clean and unmissable. A whistle. The sound shivered the wash-house window panes and carried out over the marsh. It was not a plantation signal. It was military, meant to rise above cannon, above river, above the human voice. Replies answered it, faint and many, from the tree line beyond the fields. "Damn you," Webb said. "Language," Blackwood told him without heat, and in the same breath the yard erupted. Men shouting from the north fence, dogs pulling at leads, the distant clatter of a gate thrown and found chained. The pattern of the noises told their own story. Not Tain men, these, but others. Not the house's rhythm, but something from beyond its walls. Isaiah let the stone settle and slid down the last step into the tunnel. In the dark, Ruth's breath came quick and even, the baby's a soft answer. Josephine reached for Isaiah's wrist and found it, the bones and tendons a shape she could anchor to. "Who are you?" she asked above a whisper and below a prayer. "Your best chance," Isaiah said. And then, because the truth had to be named, and hers, Josephine exhaled, turned her face toward the left-hand dark where the hidden room lay, and the right-hand dark that led beneath the yard, and chose. "Right," she said. "To the ash by the north fence." They ran bent and fast, water dripping in a steady pulse from the brick ceiling, the floor slick and cold beneath their feet. Behind them, thunder laid a flat hand on the roof of the world. The whistle sounded again, and the careful order of the Tain estate began to come apart along the lines it had always tried to hide. The tunnel ran like a vein under the yard. Brick. Damp. A steady drip counting the seconds they didn't have. Josephine led, one hand skimming the wall, the other on Ruth's elbow. So Isaiah came behind, the weight of the world and a small stolen key in his pocket. They reached the drainage grate, a black square that hummed with rain. Isaiah eased it aside and tasted the night air. Clean mud, crushed marsh grass, the sour edge of smoke from the big house. They slipped through onto slick ground and crouched low in the sedge. Dawn was only a stain in the east, the storm thinning to a soft, nagging rain. The ash tree stood ahead like a sentinel, limbs thrown wide. A figure waited beneath it, cloak pinned tight, a bay gelding and a dun mare tied to the low fence. "Ruth," the woman said, voice clipped and kind. "You're late." "Couldn't be helped," Ruth answered, the baby tucked into the cradle of her arm. "Hannah, this is my brother. And Miss Josephine." Hannah's eyes flicked over them, appraising and swift. 2 horses and a pack mule cached by the levee. "Mount up and keep low." They rode hard along the fence line, hooves muffled in soaked earth. Twice they threw themselves flat, as lantern light swept the fields in clumsy arcs. Dogs bayed and were answered by whistles that were not plantation calls. Somewhere behind, a gate rattled and did not open. In the yard they had left, Eleanor's voice went cold and precise. "Mr. Webb, bring them in. Caroline, take the south lane. Lock every door. Dr. Parnell, secure what can be moved." Parnell, grey with panic, found the hidden room rifled, labels skewed, the neat handwriting of his life's work scraped raw by absence. He gathered what he could into a case with shaking hands, and for once forgot to write it down. At the North Ferry landing, the river ran high, a slow brown muscle under the cloud-creased sky. Moses, the ferryman, stood on the slick planks, gaff hook in one fist. Jaw set the way a door is set against wind. "You're late," he said without looking up. "Couldn't be helped," Ruth said again, and then they were all motion. Hannah untying, Josephine tossing the reins, Moses hauling the flat bottom out into the elbow of water that cupped the landing. They were almost aboard when Webb came out of the trees with 2 men at his flanks. "Evening," he called, as if they were neighbors. Shotguns caught a grey shine from the river. Isaiah moved to put himself between the muzzles and Ruth. Josephine stepped, and surprised even herself by not stepping back but forward, fast enough to knock Webb off his balance. The pistol in his hand swung wide. The baby startled and wailed, a thin thread in the rain. "Easy," Moses barked, the gaff hook snapping out to herd one of the men toward the bank without striking him. "You want to swim tonight?" The second overseer lunged. Isaiah met him head-on, drove him to the boards and pinned him in 3 breaths, rain hissing on the planks around them. Webb recovered, face gone pale and mean, pistol rising, a horse cut in hard from the road. James Blackwood reined so close, his mount's shoulder brushed Webb's arm aside. He sat tall, hat brim shedding water, revolver already in his fist and steady. "Mr. Webb," he said, voice carrying clean over the river's mutter. "Stand down!" "You again," Webb spat. "I don't give orders here." Blackwood's free hand drew a folded paper from his coat and flashed the seal. "I do tonight. Federal authority. Your breeding program is contraband by any name that suits you." He didn't wait for Webb's fury to ripen. He lifted the whistle at his throat and sent 3 high notes knifing into the dawn. Replies answered, thin, then nearer, from the tree line on both banks. Webb's men hesitated. Moses didn't. "Move now," he told them all, and the ferry lurched as he shoved off. Josephine caught Ruth's elbow and pulled her over the gunwale. Isaiah vaulted after and swung the rope ladder free. The flatboat settled, low and stubborn against the current. Webb aimed at the retreating hull. Blackwood's revolver cracked first, the bullet chewing a splinter out of the planks by Webb's boot. The overseer froze, calculation warring with rage. Behind him, shapes moved in the fog along the fence. Hats, rifles, the unhurried confidence of men who were expected. The ferry slid into the channel. Rain softened to mist. Josephine knelt beside Ruth and wrapped her shawl around the baby, her fingers clumsy with cold and the sudden quiet. Isaiah stood braced at the bow, watching for the far bank, counting beats to keep the fear from taking shape. Blackwood kept pace on the near shore, horse-splash stepping the shallow edge, eyes on the river and the trees beyond. "There's a side cut a mile up," he called, voice low enough to carry only to them. "Quicker water, less seen." Josephine reached into the damp fold of her bodice and drew out her journal and a small gold locket, a bright, out-of-place thing in a morning the color of mud. She held both out to him across the narrowing water. "Keep these," she said. "If we fall short, they cannot." Blackwood took them without flourish and tucked them deep. "You won't," he said, as if it were a fact. From the landing they had left, a shout rose and fell. Webb swore. His men, seeing the uniforms thinning out of the fog, laid their guns down one by one. Somewhere back at the big house, a door slammed with a sound like a verdict. The sky to the east lifted an inch. The river thinned its growl. Moses set his feet, worked the pole, and found the seam of faster water. "For now," Ruth whispered, not sure if she was answering a question anyone had voiced. "For now," Josephine said. The river took them like a long breath, brown muscle under the flat light, chops slapping the ferry's planks in small, impatient hands. Moses felt for the seam of faster water with his pole and found it, the boat nosing into a side cut, screened by willow and cane. Hannah crouched at the stern, eyes never still. Isaiah stood at the bow with one palm on the gunwale, counting the beats of the current. Josephine knelt beside Ruth and the bundled child, her shawl pulled wide around them both. "Name?" Josephine asked, because saying a name made a life harder to erase. Ruth's mouth softened. "I call him Lark," she whispered. "So he remembers there's a world beyond rooms." "Lark," Josephine repeated. The word like a lifted note in the rain. On the near shore, James Blackwood kept pace at a trot, horse-splash stepping the shallows. The whistle he'd blown still seemed to vibrate in the air, answered and re-answered faintly from the tree line. As they entered the side cut, he put 2 fingers to his lips and answered once more. And a reply came back from the far bank, closer, steadier. Moses angled the ferry toward a low landing where cane grew thick as a wall. 2 men stepped out of it as if the river had made them. They wore plain coats dark with weather, rifles wrapped in oiled cloth. "Marshal Avery," Blackwood called across the water. "Parties 1 and 2? Avery lifted a hand. "On the north fence and the south lane," he answered. "Perimeter's tight. Your signal stirred the nest." "Good." Blackwood eased his horse up the bank until he stood level with the landing. "This boat carries 3 souls and evidence enough to choke a court." Josephine blinked at the word. Evidence. She had said it in her head for an hour. Hearing it from someone else nearly undid her. The ferry kissed the landing. Hands reached and steadied. Ruth rose, the baby warm and wordless against her breast, and took the offered forearm. Hannah followed. Josephine stood, legs trembling with spent fear, and stepped to the planks. Blackwood swung down from the saddle and came to them, hat pushed back, water slicking his lashes. "You did well," he said. "No flourish, no false comfort." To Avery, "Get the woman and child to the church mission upriver. 2 men with them." "Quiet roads." Ruth hesitated, eyes on Isaiah. "I'll bring him," Josephine said before Isaiah could promise anything dangerous. "We have 1 more to fetch." "Beatrice," Blackwood said, already knowing. He cut a glance at Avery. "I'll take 3 and circle by the canebrake. Webb will have the south and east sewn up. He's overconfident on the north." Avery's mouth went thin. "Tain's money buys loud oaths. Don't count on local hands." "I'm not." Blackwood reached into his coat and drew out the journal and the locket Josephine had given him on the water. He passed the journal back. "Keep it on you. If I go down, you keep going." Josephine took it and slid it inside her dress where the pages lay warm against her ribs. The locket glinted once in his palm, then vanished again into his pocket. his to carry where a badge could cover it. "Ruth," Isaiah said, stepping close in the small, soaked space between landing and water. "Go where they say. Don't look back. I'll find you." Ruth's jaw shook. She stilled it. "Bring Lark's uncle back to him," she said, and managed the ghost of a smile. "And Miss Josephine, too." Hannah pressed a folded cloth into Josephine's hand. Inside lay a small derringer. 2 barrels, 1 chance twice. "If you need it," she said, voice flat as the river. "If you don't, better." Josephine weighed the little gun, felt its wrongness and its necessity, and tucked it into the pocket sewn into her underskirt. "Thank you." Moses shoved off again, the ferry sliding quiet into the current with Ruth and Hannah and 2 marshals low in the hull. Josephine watched the small shape of Lark beneath the shawl until the cane closed and took the view. "Move," Blackwood said. "All business now. The house will tighten before it breaks." They ran the cane brake in a low half-crouch, water whispering off leaves onto collars. The land rose under their feet in slow inches, then flattened, then tilted again. The rain had thinned to a mean drizzle that found every seam in their clothes. A barred owl called once, and then the plantation sounds bled through. Again the alarmed clatter of men, who were used to giving orders and had lately discovered they were not the only ones with a whistle. They reached the edge of the long meadow behind the east wing and dropped to their bellies. From here the house leaned white and patient against the grey, its columns wet as bone. Smoke lifted from a dozen chimneys and Josephine's breath checked one thin black twist that was not a kitchen or a hearth. "The infirmary," Isaiah said. "They're burning something." "Or preparing to," Blackwood answered. "If Eleanor Tain can't keep it, she'll make sure no one else gets it." Josephine's hand went to the journal against her ribs. Beatrice had the rest hidden under floorboards. Parnell had stolen what he could carry. Now smoke, evidence becoming air. "We go in under the laundry yard wall," Blackwood said, eyes picking the path the way a carpenter's fingers find a hidden nail. "Isaiah, you know the turnings." "Miss Tain, Josephine," she said sharply. "Josephine." He nodded, the correction noted and set. "Stay between us. If we're seen, keep moving even if we stop." "What if you stop for good?" she asked. "Then you'll do what you've been doing all night." The ghost of a wry smile, gone as soon as it came. "You'll keep the ledger." They slipped the last hedge and slid into a drip line of crepe myrtle that kept them nearly invisible along the wall. A yard boy ran past holding a pail, eyes wide, bare feet slapping mud. Agatha's voice cut across the wet. "Shutters!" "Everyone." They reached the laundry yard gate. It was barred from within with a length of iron. Isaiah leaned his weight against it, then shook his head. "Other way," he said, tilting toward a low stretch of wall where storm had loosened the mortar. He wedged his fingers into a seam, tested and pulled. A ragged brick came free like a tooth, 4 more careful and quick, and the gap gave enough to crawl through. Inside the yard, steam rose where rain hit the banked fire under the copper tubs. Someone had left a rake propped by the ash, ordinary as a sermon. Blackwood signaled, flat palm wait, then flicked 2 fingers go. They crossed the yard in a bent run, slipped through the scullery door, and found the shadowed understairs that led up to the family floors. On the second landing, voices floated like moths, thin, fluttering, persistent. "Found the ledger gone?" Caroline, the marshals. "Dr. Parnell, take the tinctures and the case and go to the carriage house." "We burn what cannot be moved," Eleanor's voice, calm to the point of cruelty, carried as if the house were designed to carry it. Blackwood took the stairs, 3 at a time, to the next landing and stopped them with a hand. "We split," he breathed. "I'll draw whoever's on this hall. You 2 go to Josephine's room. Get the sack if it's not already gone. If Beatrice is there." Josephine didn't let him finish. "I know." He gave a small nod, then stepped out into the hall like he belonged there and said, "Perfectly dry, Mrs. Tain." There was a silence, shocked and short, followed by the sleek slide of Eleanor's voice. "Lieutenant, you've wandered far from the parlor." "Federal jurisdiction wanders," Blackwood said lightly. "It's a habit." Josephine pulled Isaiah down the opposite corridor and into her room, door closing on a whisper. She went to the bed and dropped to her knees, fingers searching along the board she knew to be loose. It lifted with a faint sigh, empty. Her stomach went cold. "She took it," she said. "Good girl." A floorboard creaked in the hall. Isaiah's hand tightened around the knife at his belt. Josephine was already moving, crossing to the wardrobe, pressing the spring that opened the built-in drawer her father had once used for pistols. Inside lay the small oilcloth parcel Beatrice had sometimes tucked letters into, a child's secret that had aged into a habit. It was there. And under it, folded and folded again, a single sheet torn from a ledger, edges jagged. Dates. Pairings, a name, Beatrice. Josephine's breath snagged. A quick line in her father's tight hand. Host arranged. Tain line maintained. She slid both into her bodice and turned as the door handle depressed. "Don't scream," Caroline said, stepping in with the pistol already leveled. The muzzle looked bigger than it had in the rain. Her hair was damp and tidy, her eyes steady in a way that made Josephine's old fear of her feel suddenly justified. "I wasn't going to," Josephine answered, and was surprised to find it true. Isaiah moved an inch. Caroline didn't glance at him. Her focus was a wire between sisters. "You have something that belongs to Mother," Caroline said, "and some things that belong to me, such as your soul," Josephine said before she could stop herself. Caroline's mouth twitched. "You always mistake will for sin, and you mistake obedience for virtue, and enough." The pistol didn't waver. "Give me the papers." "Then call the men outside." "We'll walk to the study, and this will look the way it should have looked from the start." "No," Josephine said simply. Caroline's eyes flicked, once, the smallest movement, to the clock on the mantel. Timing. Even now she was calibrating. From the hall, Eleanor's voice rose, clipped at last. "Burn it." A new sound cut the house. Heavy doors thrown wide, men shouting in alarm, not anger, boots that did not know these floors. Blackwood's calm tenor rode above them, controlled and commanding, and then another man's voice took up the thread. Marshal Avery, by the rasp of it. Caroline's jaw set. "You brought them into our house," she said, expression flattening into something harder than fury. "Then you leave us no room for mercy." She cocked the pistol. Isaiah went then. No grand gesture, no yell, just a clean, fast step that put his forearm under Caroline's wrist and levered it up as the shot cracked. Plaster spat from the crown molding. Josephine moved at the same breath, driving her shoulder into Caroline's ribs and knocking her backward onto the carpet. They went down in a tangle, the pistol skittering under the bed. For a heartbeat, the three were a knot of limbs and breath and old anger. Caroline came up with a knife from her boot, like a magician producing a dove. Josephine's hand found the underskirt pocket. The derringer was small and warm and wrong. She drew it and let it point where her hand and terror insisted. "Don't," she said, and the word was not a plea. Caroline's eyes took in the little gun, the stance, her sister's shaking arm, and in them Josephine saw the girl she had once followed through woods, who had once lifted her over a creek. It lasted the length of a raindrop's fall. Caroline eased the knife back into her palm. "You won't fire," she said quietly. "Try me," Josephine answered, and believed it so fully the belief reached her trigger finger. Boots pounded past the door. Agatha's voice rose above the din for the first time, not an order this time, but a prayer. Something in the air changed. Heat, a dry lick through the wet. Smoke slid under the door like a cat. "The infirmary," Isaiah said. Josephine's mind made two pictures at once, jars and ledgers and flame, women behind barred doors, while men argued jurisdiction. She backed toward the door without lowering the derringer, Isaiah with her, eyes on Caroline. "We're going," she said. "You can decide what to do with your knife when the chimneys stop breathing." Caroline did not move to stop them. She stood, ran a thumb along the knuckles of the hand Isaiah had wrenched, and looked at her sister, as if memorizing the set of Josephine's mouth. "Mother will not forgive you," she said. Josephine opened the door into smoke and shouting. "Then let her practice," she said, and stepped into the hall. Down the corridor, flame had begun to paint the edges of the world, the faint, awful orange of something that had no place in a house and had found one anyway. Somewhere below, Eleanor Tain was giving orders like a captain on a sinking ship. Somewhere above, a baby woke and wailed, and another voice hushed it, fierce and tired. Isaiah touched Josephine's elbow, a question and a readiness. She set her jaw. "To the infirmary," she said. "If Eleanor burns proof, we'll save people." They ran toward the smoke. Smoke slicked the hallway, warm as a living thing. Josephine tied a wet handkerchief over her mouth, thrust another at Isaiah, and ran. The house's ordered sounds, silver-set shoes shined, doors shut soft, had ruptured into shouts, coughs, and the blunt thud of boots that didn't belong. The pump. Agatha's voice cut through the haze, sharp with purpose. She appeared out of the grey with a sloshing bucket, eyes fierce. Back cisterns primed. Here's a chin jerk at Isaiah. Take this key ring. Ward doors. Don't waste time. Beatrice? Josephine asked. Agatha's look flickered. Linen room east side. I kept her out of her mother's way. Then she was gone again, shouting orders men obeyed without thinking. They should have turned east. They went south. The infirmary breathed smoke like a kiln. A bar of orange licked along the eaves, where someone had thrown a lantern and courage together. Isaiah shouldered the service door. Kit stuck, then tore free with a groan. Inside, heat slapped them. Nurse Hammond, face streaked and hair loosed, fought to pull a woman from a bed. "Keys!" she barked reflexively. Then saw the pair in the doorway and the look in Josephine's eyes. She faltered, the old obedience warring with the new emergency. "Get them out," she said, and that was all. Isaiah worked the first lock with Agatha's ring, then the second when the first key failed. The corridor filled with bodies, limping, coughing, carrying infants, carrying each other. Josephine jerked open cabinets and tore down linens, dunked them in a bucket, pressed them into hands. "Cover your face, stay low, follow the wall." "Ruth?" a woman croaked, panic clawing her throat even as smoke did. "Where is Ruth?" "Safe," Josephine answered without hesitation. "On the river. Go." Flame found a run of lamp oil and threw a thin tongue across the floorboards toward the recovery ward. Isaiah stomped it out with his heel and went to the third door on the right. Gone. Empty pallet, neat as if someone had planned a fire. "Parnell." He spat and the name tasted like iron. At the far end, a glow built and pulsed, a room fully caught. Josephine counted heads, counted the small weights cradled in arms, counted herself because she had to. The woman at her elbow kept saying, "Please," not asking anything. The word a rhythm to walk by. They reached the exit just as a brace of men skidded into the corridor from outside. Marshals with soaked coats and wet bandanas tied over their mouths. Blackwood behind them, hat gone, hair plastered to his skull. Eyes very clear. "Left row cleared," Josephine said before he could ask. "Right row, 2 still inside. 1 near term," she pointed. "Parnell's likely headed for the carriage house with a case." Blackwood nodded once. "Avery!" he shouted. "Split. You and Rourke with me to the carriage house. Ellis, this way. We pull them out or we tear the wall." Isaiah didn't wait for assignment. He plunged back into the heat with Ellis, shoulders down, breath measured. Josephine pressed her back to the jam, made herself a hinge for women and babies to move past. A girl no older than Beatrice stumbled over the threshold, empty-armed, eyes dazed. "Hands," Josephine said, taking the girl's fingers, rubbing circulation back. "Breathe." "Stay with me." "Miss," the girl rasped, mouth working. They said the doctor was taking the jars." Josephine felt something tilt inside her. "Noted," she said, holding the girl's gaze because someone had to. Isaiah and Ellis reappeared with one woman slung between them, another behind gripping Ellis's belt and holding a round belly as if to keep her child from stepping into the world too soon. They spilled out into rain that hissed against the blaze. Marshals doused the lintel. Agatha took the pregnant woman's other elbow, voice low and sure now, a tide pulling the panicked into a safer current. "Go," Blackwood called from the yard's far side. "Carriage house." Josephine ran. The carriage house doors were flung wide, lanterns swinging. Dr. Parnell hauled a heavy case toward a waiting wagon, face grey with exertion and something like grief. 2 footmen, boys really, fumbled with the harness. "Doctor," Blackwood said as he closed the distance, pistol low, voice conversational. "Set the case down." Parnell froze as if someone had cut his strings. He looked at the weapon, at Blackwood's eyes, at the case that held 20 years of careful cruelty, and applied justification. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "This work ends," Blackwood said, and something like pity thinned his tone for half a breath. "Put it down," Parnell obeyed. For a second, his hand stayed on the lid. Then he lifted both palms shoulder high, suddenly old. Avery stepped in and bound his wrists. The footman melted, one dropping the trace in his scramble. A crack split the yard air, gunfire. Another answered from the porch of the big house. Silas Webb stood under the portico, shotgun braced on the newel, the lines of his face set to meanness. He fired again, cutting the hat from a marshal's head and the corner from a column. He reloaded fast, practiced, ugly. Down. Blackwood barked. He pulled Josephine with him behind the wagon wheel. Chips of paint spat from the spokes as buckshot chewed wood. Front steps, he shouted to Avery. Take him shallow. Keep him shooting at you. Gladly, Avery growled and slid along the limber as two deputies flanked wide. Shots traded, 3 crisp, 2 ragged. Then a shout as one pellet grazed a deputy's shoulder and another took brick from the baluster. Josephine peered around the wheel. Webb chambered, lifted, aimed where Blackwood had been. She had 1 small gun, 2 barrels. She thought of Caroline's voice saying, "You won't fire," and felt her finger decide. She rose enough, aimed where her father's lesson, long ago in a cold fall field, had told her a man's balance lived and squeezed. The derringer popped like a cracking twig. Webb grunted and dropped a fraction. Shot bit his thigh, not a kill, but the balance fumbled and the barrel jerked. Blackwood's revolver spoke over it. 1-2, and the shotgun leaped from Webb's hands. He staggered backward into the newel and slid to the step, shock spreading across his face like a stain. The yard seemed to inhale. Then men surged. Marshals up the steps, Webb pinned, the shotgun kicked away. Blackwood reached for Josephine's wrist, where the little gun still shook in her hand. He eased her grip open, pocketed the derringer, and met her eyes. Good shot, he said, and meant you're still here. Beatrice, Josephine said, because the name had been beating under her ribs throughout. Go, Blackwood answered. Avery and I will keep this side quiet. Josephine ran for the east wing, Isaiah with her, both of them soaked, both coughing. They passed through the scullery, the air there absurdly domestic with onions and damp ash, into the narrow corridor that served the linen room. Voices pressed from the far end, a woman's low and steady, a younger woman's high, fraying at the edges. You will come with me, Eleanor was saying. You will not disgrace your name on your birthday or any day after. Mother, Beatrice said, and Josephine heard the hitch. Fear, yes, but an iron under it Josephine hadn't known she possessed. No, Josephine stepped into the doorway. The linen room was close and warm, steam ghosting the edges of shelves stacked with folded cloth. Eleanor stood poised, composed even in ruin, one gloved hand resting on the open door of a tall armoire. Beatrice stood opposite, cheeks wet, jaw set, Agatha between them with both palms lifted in the old useless gesture that means peace when no one intends it. Eleanor turned her head, calm as a swan. Josephine, she said, you've brought strangers into our home. You've endangered your sisters. Come here now. Across from her, Caroline leaned in the threshold, pale, one sleeve dark where Isaiah had wrenched it, pistol nowhere. Eyes on no one and everything. No, Josephine said, and realized she was done with that tone forever. It's over, Mother. The marshals are on the stairs. Dr. Parnell is in irons. Webb is finished. The infirmary, her voice caught. The women are out. Eleanor's gaze did not waver. Do you imagine Charleston will weep for them? She asked, voice soft as lace. Do you imagine the men who dine at my table will not dine again? You've read my ledgers. You know how the world keeps its books. Josephine stepped closer. Then we'll at least unmask the arithmetic, she said. She felt Isaiah move a half-pace forward beside her. There, silent, a presence her body had begun to count as necessary. Eleanor's eyes slid to him. You, she said with all the disdain she could distill into a single syllable. You've always been useful, strong, predictable. You could have stood well in my program. Isaiah said nothing. It was more eloquent than any curse. Beatrice's breath sounded fast. Mother, she said again, small but steady, I won't. Eleanor's glove closed on the armoire door, and with a quick motion she pulled it wide. Inside, behind neat stacks of tablecloths, a panel waited with a recessed loop. She hooked it and yanked. The back swung in to reveal a narrow stair, black as a throat. Up, she told Beatrice. Now. Enough, Josephine snapped and reached for Beatrice's hand. Caroline moved then, not toward Josephine, but not toward Eleanor either. She stepped sideways and put her back to the shelf, as if trying to hold the whole room in place by will. Her voice, when it came, was thin with something like shock. Mother, don't. Eleanor didn't look at her. Agatha, she said coolly. Step aside. Agatha did not. I've stepped aside for 20 years, she said, voice low. No more. Boots hammered at the far end of the corridor. Men's voices, marshals, called to one another. Eleanor's composure at last cracked. A flicker of calculation bled into something angrier. She stepped for the stair. Isaiah moved to block her. For a moment no one breathed. Then plainly, inevitably, the house decided for them. Smoke drifted through the open door in a thicker sheet. Someone shouted fire in the roof, and a tile slid loose outside with the clatter of plates hitting stone. Caroline flinched, and in that flinch chose. She crossed the room in 2 strides, seized Beatrice's arm, and pulled her backward, away from the panel, away from Eleanor, not gentle, not kind, but decisive. "Go with them," she said, eyes on the floor as if the words were treason. "Now." Eleanor stared at her eldest as if at a stranger. Caroline didn't answer. She lifted her chin and met Josephine's eyes for the first time without an edge. "Take her," she said. "Get out." Marshal Avery filled the doorway with 2 deputies behind him, pistol ready, face set. He took in the panel, the women. Isaiah squared in front of Eleanor. "Mrs. Tain," he said, as if greeting a parishioner, "you're under federal arrest." Eleanor's smile came back then, small and unreadable. "I wonder for how long," she murmured. But she lifted her hands. Avery stepped in. Isaiah shifted just enough to give him the space. Josephine tugged Beatrice into the hall. Caroline stood where she was, hand flat against the shelf, as if bracing a wall. "Come," Josephine said to her. Caroline shook her head once. "I have to see what burns," she said, and it was impossible to tell whether she meant the infirmary, the ledgers, or the life she had lived. They moved. Down the stairs, through heat and rain and men in uniforms that did not know these halls. In the yard, the infirmary roof sagged and spit. Women huddled under wet blankets. Agatha emerged behind them with a lantern she must have snatched from a hand, her chin high, eyes bright with tears that had no time to fall. Josephine found Ruth's absence and let it be a presence anyway. She felt Beatrice's fingers cut into her own and held tighter. Blackwood strode toward them, smoke-streaked, mouth a hard line, but his eyes softened when he saw who stood intact. He looked past them toward the east wing where marshals were leading Eleanor across the wet lawn. "It's not over," he said quietly, "but it's begun." The roof of the infirmary gave a long, low groan and settled an inch. Rain hit flame with a hiss like a secret made public. Josephine raised her chin into the weather and, for the first time since she had opened her floorboard and pulled her journal free, felt the world tilt towards something that might be new. By mid-morning the storm had worn itself thin. Smoke from the infirmary hung in the live oaks like a veil, drifting and tearing as the wind found it. The white columns took soot, the way a conscience takes stain, first lightly, then in strokes that would not be scrubbed out. In the yard, order began to reassemble itself into a different shape. Agatha turned the wash benches into a place for bandages, lined the rescued women along the lee of the carriage house, and set 2 kitchen boys to boil water, whether they liked it or not. Hannah moved among them with a jar of salve and a voice that kept breath steady. A marshal posted at the gate called and answered in a rhythm the house had never known. Josephine worked until her lungs stopped complaining about smoke, and the tremor in her hands belonged to exertion instead of fear. She wrapped a burned palm. She held a baby to a breast that would not let down until the mother heard a sister speak her name right. She pressed wet cloth to her brow and murmured, "You're out, you're out," until the woman's eyes focused on the sky and recognized it. Isaiah scanned faces and found Ruth's absence like a presence he could stand on. Moses's ferry would be around the bend by now. Lark would have taken milk and carried it like a secret. He allowed himself that picture, and then set his jaw again because the day still had teeth. Blackwood moved like the hub of a wheel, quieting one panic, directing another. He sent a pair of marshals to the south lane with written orders. He posted 2 more by the office safe. He received the case from Avery with the lift of an eyebrow that meant this is enough to hang a governor if the rope is federal. Dr. Parnell sat on a stool at the edge of the yard, wrists tied, a blanket around his shaking shoulders, and stared at his shoes as if they were a puzzle he had once been able to solve. Eleanor came out between deputies, gloved hands now ungloved, hair undone by the rain. She kept her spine as straight as the column behind her and stepped into the yard as if receiving callers. When she saw Josephine, her mouth softened into the smile that had convinced half of Charleston she was kindness made flesh. "My dear," she said, almost tenderly. Josephine wiped her palms on her smoke-streaked skirt and met her mother's eyes without dipping her head. "Mrs. Tain," Avery read the charge: illegal trafficking, unlawful confinement, destruction of evidence under color of law, and for each phrase Eleanor's smile thinned, then held. When he finished, she looked past him toward the drive where her carriage would have stood, and then back to Josephine. "This will not stick," she said quietly. "Men you have never met will say your name over dinner and decide what the law ought to mean this season. They will send me home with apologies. Then let them say my name too," Josephine answered. "Say it in the papers. Say it in the custom house. I'll bring them ledgers enough to make the arithmetic public." Eleanor's gaze flicked just once toward the burned eaves. "Jars can be replaced," she said. "Records rewritten. You cannot rewrite blood." "No," Josephine said, "but I can trace it. And I can stop you from using it," Avery gestured, and Eleanor allowed herself to be led to the waiting wagon. She went up with the grace she brought to every stair she'd ever climbed, turned once and looked not at Josephine but at Caroline, who stood a little apart in the shadow of the east wing, sleeve torn. "Face the pale of a woman who has discovered her mirror lies, daughter," Eleanor said simply. Caroline didn't answer. She watched the wagon door close with a small click and stayed where she was, as if rooted. Blackwood came to Josephine then, his hat gone, hair drying in reluctant curls. "I'll take her to the custom house and lock her in a room with iron that doesn't answer to Charleston," he said. "Marshal Avery holds the grounds until we can remove the women. I want sworn statements this afternoon. Federal clerk, not local." "Will you speak on the record?" Josephine touched the bodice where her journal rested warm against her ribs. "I've been writing the record for 2 years, she said. "I'll read it aloud." He gave a short nod. "We don't bring this through Judge Hale," he added, watching her face for offense. "He dines at this table." "I know," Josephine said, and realized she did. "I had to live long enough to admit it." A cry went up by the kitchen yard. Not fear now, but news traveling faster than prudence. Beatrice came stumbling across the wet grass, hair unpinned, cheeks blotched by smoke and tears. Hand threw herself against Josephine's shoulder, hard enough to knock the wind from them both. "I thought," Beatrice began. "Hand couldn't finish. You didn't," Josephine said, hugging her. "You hid what mattered and then you moved." Beatrice pulled back and looked toward the carriage house where Parnell sat, and then toward the wagon where Eleanor's shadow crossed the small barred window. "What happens to us?" she asked, meaning not only the next hours. "You come to the custom house with me," Josephine answered. "You tell the truth. After that we go beyond Charleston. For a while. Agatha knows people. So do the marshals. Hannah," she glanced at the line of women. "Ruth will send word when she's safe. We'll be where she is soon enough." Beatrice swallowed, nodding, and then her gaze snagged on a figure at the edge of the gravel. Caroline, still unmoving. The youngest sister's hand tightened in Josephine's. "What about her?" Josephine had no answer that did not feel like a wound. She left Beatrice with Agatha to gather a bundle and cross the yard. Caroline saw her coming and didn't move. Up close, the steadiness in her eyes looked like exhaustion that had taken a seat and refused to be budged. For a long moment the two of them merely stood, listening to the building hiss of the infirmary and the quiet calls of men who were learning the house's names for itself. "Dairy." "Still room tack, I told her no," Caroline said at last. "You saw it." "I saw you pull B away from the panel," Josephine said. "I saw you leave a door open." Caroline's mouth twitched, a near smile that died quickly. She drew a small iron key from her pocket and put it in Josephine's hand. "Father's desk, the false back," she said. "There's a portrait of grandfather in the study. The frame comes away if you press the lower right. Behind it is a narrow safe, 2 ledgers older than the others, names that sit higher up the table." Josephine felt the key like a coin whose value she would never count alone. "Why give this to me?" "Because I did what I did," Caroline said, and the words landed with a dull certainty that made Josephine's stomach drop. "The winter he died, he threatened to talk. He said he was called to confess. He told me that confession would put us all in the street." She looked down at her hands, turning them as if to check they were still hers. "So I stopped him. I told myself I was saving us. I told myself he had begun it, that we would perfect it, that history excuses the first cut if the tailoring is fine." Josephine's throat worked. For a heartbeat, she saw the creek in the woods where Caroline had once hoisted her on her back because the water was too high. She saw the pistol's small mouth and the way Caroline had flinched when it kicked. "You can tell the clerk," Josephine said when her voice returned. "Or you can tell me and I'll write it. Both, Caroline said. If you get me as far as iron that answers to Washington. Josephine nodded. Come then. Caroline glanced at the wagon where their mother sat behind a barred square. She will hate me more for this than she hates you. I imagine she has room, Josephine said. She built a great house. Caroline's exhale was almost a laugh and not at all one. She fell into step beside her sister, and together they crossed the yard. Isaiah met them halfway, eyes on the road where Avery had put 2 wagons and a string of horses into order. I'm riding with the first party to the mission, he said. Hannah wants men she trusts, and I have to see Ruth with my own eyes. Go, Josephine said. She reached for his hand without thinking, and pressed into it a folded scrap torn from the back of her journal. Directions to the custom house, and the name of the clerk who won't look to Eleanor first. When Ruth is steady, bring her there or send word where to meet. He closed his fingers over the paper, and over her knuckles both. For a blink, the yard, the smoke, the shouting drew back from them, and there was only the fact of 2 people still breathing. I'll find you, he said. I'll be writing, she answered, and let go. Blackwood swung into the saddle and raised his hand. Move out! The little procession sorted itself into a shape that made improbable sense. Marshals flanking a prisoner wagon, another wagon full of blankets and children, and 2 extraordinary copper pots. Hannah on a mule she had not asked permission to borrow. Moses striding alongside muttering about currents. Isaiah at the head with Avery. Josephine and Beatrice on a borrowed buggy, with a marshal at the reins. Caroline walking until someone thrust the unused side saddle into her hands and said, "Take it or be left," and she took it. As the wheels turned onto the drive, Josephine looked back once. The house, her life, her cage, stood with one wing blackened, with jars shattered under sodden ash. With ledgers missing from their shelves and a portrait frame, she meant to pry free before the marshals sealed the door. Agatha stood in the center of the yard like a general who had discovered her army in the kitchen and found it equal to any campaign. Josephine took the pencil from her pocket and, braced against the jolt of the buggy, wrote at the top of a damp page, August 18th, 1836. The books begin to balance. She tucked the journal away, squared her shoulders against the wet that would take hours to leave her bones, and faced the road to Charleston. Morning crept over the Tain Plantation, a dull grey light that revealed what the night had undone. Where once columns gleamed white, now they were streaked with soot. The once manicured gardens were a churn of mud and trampled flowers. Smoke drifted from the infirmary's blackened shell, its ashes spreading slowly over the wet ground like a funeral veil. Agatha organized the survivors in the yard, turning chaos into rhythm. "Line up for dressings 2 at a time," she called. "We've got clean rags and boiled water. Use them both." Women sat wrapped in blankets, their faces hollow but free. Josephine moved among them, binding burns, soothing the newborns who whimpered at the strange light. Every small cry was a sound the plantation had never allowed to live this long. Isaiah stood by the fence, hat in hand, watching for the ferry returning from upriver. He had slept none, though he looked more awake than he ever had. When the marshals came down from the main house, leading Eleanor Tain in iron cuffs, he didn't move. He only watched. Eleanor held her chin high even as mud spattered her skirts. "You think this ends with me?" she said, her voice smooth despite the manacles. "You think Charleston will destroy one of its own?" Blackwood stood opposite her, jaw tight. "You're not Charleston anymore, Mrs. Tain, your evidence." Josephine stepped forward, journal in hand. "I've written everything," she said. "Every record, every name. You'll answer for all of it." Eleanor's eyes flicked toward her, proud and poisonous. "Then write this, daughter," she hissed. "You are mine, and so is every drop of blood that fights me." The marshals led her away. By noon the rain had washed most of the smoke away. The air smelled of ash and iron. Caroline stood near the east wing, motionless. Josephine approached, the pages of her journal pressed against her chest. "She's gone," Josephine said softly. Caroline didn't turn. "No, she's only changed rooms." She handed Josephine a small brass key, her fingers shaking. Behind Father's portrait, 2 ledgers. They name the men who bought her silence. "If you're going to finish this, you'll need them." Josephine hesitated. "Why give them to me?" "Because you can do what I can't," Caroline said. "Tell the truth and live after it." Josephine reached for her hand. "Then come with us." Caroline shook her head. "I'll stay until it's rebuilt or buried." The house will need a witness. By late afternoon, the yard filled with movement again. The rescued women prepared to leave with the marshals. Beatrice stood near the carriage steps, hair braided, eyes red but steady. She pressed Ruth's small bundle into Josephine's arms. Lark slept inside, his tiny hand curled like a promise. "Keep him safe," Beatrice whispered. "I will," Josephine said. "And you'll see him again." Isaiah waited at the road, his shirt torn, face shadowed with exhaustion. Blackwood approached him, extending a paper sealed with the federal crest. "Safe passage north," he said. "For you, Ruth, and the others." "I'll see to Mrs. Tain's trial myself," Isaiah nodded. "And after?" "After," Blackwood said, "we rebuild what she tried to erase." Josephine climbed into the wagon, journal on her lap. As it rolled down the muddy road, she looked back at the Tain mansion, its windows blown open, its white facade grey with smoke. The house that had once ruled over 100 lives now stood hollow, watching its captives leave. She opened her journal and wrote her final entry. August 18th, 1836. The books are balanced at last. The price of silence is paid. The truth belongs to no master. The wagon turned toward Charleston, and for the first time the road ahead did not lead back.